Hi, everybody. This is the first of 2 weeks addressing reading comprehension. This week we are focusing on comprehension of narrative text, stories in other words, and next week we are focusing on informational or expository text. There are 2 readings that are up on Moodle. One you've had before under the title Text Talk, and that is Encouraging Young Children's Language Interactions with Stories. And the second is the chapter from the Best Practices in Literacy Instruction text, and this chapter has to do with narrative text comprehension. Backing up, let's review a little bit about what contributes to reading comprehension, and in specific, the role of word recognition in reading comprehension instruction. We've been talking this entire semester about the simple view of reading, that skilled reading consists most simply of decoding and linguistic comprehension. Meaning that there are these two, if we look at the sort of the rope model, these two strands, one which is word recognition and one which is listening or linguistic comprehension. Never to suggest that decoding is sufficient. It is necessary, but not sufficient for reading comprehension. Contributing to the simple view and sort of expanding on it is this theory of automaticity promoted by Jay Samuels and others, that word recognition needs to become automatic. That's the fluency piece or a portion of fluency, in order for more cognitive energy and attention to be devoted to understanding the text. So that's the role of decoding and automatic decoding in reading comprehension. But it's so important that instruction in word recognition be accompanied by instruction focusing on comprehension from the very beginning. So again, sort of the rope model, what I've just been talking about, that word recognition becomes increasingly automatic, and language comprehension and all of its incredibly complex elements and components become increasingly strategic, which is what we'll talk about at the end of this session more. But there are students we know who struggle with comprehension despite having very good, more than adequate word recognition skills. And this is what Jeannie Shaw talked about as a 4th grade slump. It may occur or it may not occur, but it tends to occur when learning to read shifts to reading to learn. And what happens is that whereas in kindergarten, 1st grade, and 2nd grade, what children are reading is very familiar and very quote unquote easy to understand, by the time it hits 3rd grade and particularly 4th grade and beyond, what becomes increasingly important is being able to understand the words that are written on the page. So the skills shift as the texts become more complex. And that gets played out empirically. This was a study looking at 600 children, a longitudinal study conducted by Katz and Kami. In 2nd grade, the way you read this chart is that on measures of reading comprehension, those who did less well on those measures of reading comprehension did less well because of either poor decoding, poor language comprehension, or both, or some other variables, in some cases unrelated to language. In 2nd grade, of those poor comprehenders, 32%, nearly 33%, had decoding challenges. Only 16% had language issues. However, by 4th grade, the number of poor comprehenders that had decoding problems is reduced, and the number who have language problems increases. And the same is true, of course, by 8th grade. So an increasing number of children who are having reading comprehension problems are having those problems because of language issues, not decoding issues. So how do we avoid this? Well, one way is reading aloud to children. Recall that what children read in kindergarten, first and second grade, and even into third grade is not sufficiently challenging in terms of content for them to really have to stretch their sort of strategy behaviors, their activation, what we talked about with Tavani, activation of background knowledge. It doesn't really challenge their vocabulary or enhance their vocabulary. It doesn't demand of them some strategic independent thinking. How do you get to that? How do you help kids in kindergarten, first and second grade, or at any age who are reading texts at that level, develop those linguistic skills while you read to them? And that's true if it's a 6-year-old or if it happens to be a 10-year-old who is having tremendous difficulty accessing text. So reading aloud to children has been known to be a predictor of good reading achievement for over 50 years. However, that predictive relationship is heavily confounded by other factors that reside when you're looking at home reading. So the amount of time that parents read to their children is related to academic performance, reading performance specifically later on, but so is socioeconomic status, the number of books in the home, the amount of language in the home, etc. So there are these other variables that also contribute, even though there's a high correlation. At school, the quality and the extent to which reading aloud to children will help promote those important linguistic comprehension skills depends upon the nature of the talk surrounding the read aloud activity. But done well, reading aloud is very powerful because it exposes children to vocabulary that they don't normally hear in conversation, to sentence structures they don't normally hear in conversation, to information that they don't normally hear in everyday conversation, and to literary conventions and story structure. So what does talk around stories look like? Well, sometimes it's not very effective. Children may go off on a tangent. They may talk about something that is experiential to them, but not specific to the story. It may be a question asked and then little wait time and the teacher filling in the answer. And unfortunately, in some research which was conducted in observational work, it was found that ineffective talk around storybook reading is much more prevalent than effective talk. And I say storybook reading, but any kind of oral listening reading activity, whether it's books on tape for high school kids or it's reading a big book to a group of first graders. What does effective talk look like? Well, it occurs as the story is being read, not necessarily only afterwards, and it's analytic. It focuses on important story information. It may be before, during, and after, but specific story episodes. And an effective approach to effective talk is dialogic reading. So let's go back. I want to look at that second bullet, which suggests that it focuses on important story information. And so one way to structure this is to use story maps. And story maps refer students back to the essential elements of a story, the story structure. So stories have a setting, they occur in some place, they have a character or more than one characters, the story is about someone, and there are events that take place, and often these events are organized around a problem and a solution. And so story maps and WH questions, where, who, what, align very nicely with story maps. So a couple of examples. I know you're familiar with story maps, but two very simple ones, a little more room for variety in the second, and then a much more complex one, which includes both rising action and falling action. But what story maps do is they provide a structure for kids to hang events and ideas on and people on. And so it is a scaffold for kids as they're reading through narrative text. And narrative text consistently follow this structure. And if kids know this, then they can read to look for the setting, read to look for the characters, etc. So one thing I encourage you to use in narrative comprehension activities are story maps. Dialogic reading is an approach to reading to children and with children, developed by Whitehurst and others back in the late 1980s, and it is still very well thought of. It's used primarily with preschool or kindergarten children, but as we'll sort of go through today's slides, you'll see that some of the principles of dialogic reading get reused in some of the strategy instruction. So the notion is that it's conversational, that the adult asks open-ended questions and expands on the children's utterances. So one of the things that researchers do is they count the number of words in a child's responses to a question, and they look over time to see if those number of words increases, and that's what you're looking for when you're doing this kind of reading activity. So it enhances language skills, it supports emergent literacy. And this program that we have in the clinic, and which I would encourage you, even if you don't use, but to take a look at, because I think particularly if you're working with elementary and early elementary children, it's just an excellent resource, and that's Text Talk. So the authors of Text Talk were the ones in there that's encouraging language interaction with stories piece that is up on Moodle this week and also was up earlier, is that suggests that approximately 90% of teachers read stories aloud for pleasure, rather than turning it into a really highly productive instructional activity. So questions following a story, and I know you've seen teachers do this, and I've certainly seen some of my students do this, is that they will read a story and then ask the children if they liked it. And maybe even ask, what part of the story did you like best? Or which character do you think is most like you? Or have you ever had an experience like that before? And so there's discussion and there's talk around the story, but we don't really know whether or not the children understood the story. So Text Talk as dialogic reading suggests, ask that you ask open-ended questions. So these are some questions that accompany Harry the Dirty Dog, and I think you may have actually seen these before, but they're definitely, they are in that particular article. So when you ask what's happening, it means that they have to describe something from the story. What do we know so far about the family? Well, they have to begin to put pieces together about what you've been reading to them. What do they know about the story? And how have things changed? Well, now all of a sudden we are into plot. And how does what Harry did fit in with what we already know about him? Now we've got something about character and character traits. What's Harry up to now? Again, sort of plot and putting that all together. And certainly they called Harry this little doggy. What does that tell us about what they know about Harry and this dog that they're seeing? So open-ended questions. Part of the reason teachers are reluctant at all grades to ask open-ended questions, it's like the lawyer who goes into court and asks a question to which he doesn't know the answer. Well, you never do that, supposedly. But as a teacher, you ask an open-ended question and you don't know what the answer is going to be, and that can be kind of scary. So you do have to know how to kind of follow up when children's responses are limited or incomplete. And in this article, it gives you some ideas. One is adopt a conversational style or tone. The other is to reread the text. And here, just a couple of examples. I'm not going to go through these, but this idea of a conversational tone, if you can think of yourself as having a conversation with a child or having a conversation with a student, it's very different than thinking of asking a question and there's a right or wrong answer. So kind of think about that. You can repeat what the student said, and this, it's kind of funny, it seems like almost like a therapy session to me, but what's happening to Hansel and Gretel? They're getting lost. How did that happen to Hansel and Gretel? The student says they walked in the woods. So what the teacher's trying to pull out here is, does the student really know what it means to get lost? And can they make a connection between walking in the woods and getting lost? And so finally, the teacher ends by saying, okay, so they walked until it was dark. Okay, so darkness has something to do with this, walking and walking until it gets dark, so they couldn't find their way anymore. In other words, they couldn't find their way anymore, a definition of so they were lost. And then finally, don't be afraid to reread the text as often as needed. It is a permanent resource, and I guess children, it's just important for children to realize that it's not going to change. And it's not cheating to go back to the text, because the text is telling you something. It's if comprehension is extracting and generating meaning from the text, you first have to extract it. You have to know what's in the text, and keep going back to the text as the default strategy rather than guessing as the default strategy. Now, again, this is text talk, and it's meant to be used when children are not reading the text themselves, but they are having the text read to them. Again, something that has to happen. The comprehension work for younger children has to occur while they are listening to text, not while they are reading it. It just isn't rich enough text if they can decode it, and they're in first or second grade typically. You can do a little bit of that, but it shouldn't be the heart and soul of your comprehension program. So let's go back and see what we've got here. So in terms of language comprehension, you can read to students or they can listen to books on tape. Again, for older students, high school students, we're spending a lot of time at Hamilton High School having them listen to books on tape and then engaging in text talk around those books they've been listening to. So what's here? Well, background knowledge. Is background knowledge important? Yes. I'll come back to that. Vocabulary? Yes. Language structures. The notion of syntax. One of your, one of the clinical notes that came in this week talked about difficulties with pronouns, and that's syntax. Inference and metaphor, literary devices, and then literary knowledge, genres, knowing that different genres have different structures. So let's pull those things apart. What about content knowledge? Well, there are many studies that support the important role of background knowledge. Kids who are whizzes at chess do better than adults who are not experienced chess players, maybe know a little bit about it, on understanding passages about chess. So background knowledge, and there are lots of these kinds of passages around, makes a lot of difference. And that's why if you're going to be tackling some sort of a story, say it's a story that occurs around the time of the Kennedy assassination, providing that kind of background knowledge about what was occurring during that time and why is important. So what happens before you ever open the text is very, very important in terms of content knowledge. You can do that. That's not that hard to do. What about vocabulary knowledge? We've been talking a lot about how important word meaning is, and that kids get caught up on individual words. And if you don't know the meaning of the individual words, it's very difficult to put together a passage and understand a passage. However, just as decoding is necessary but not sufficient, just as fluency, some level of fluency, is necessary but not sufficient, content knowledge is necessary but apparently not sufficient, and vocabulary is apparently necessary but not sufficient. There are kids who have all of those skills intact, and yet they still have a great deal of difficulty understanding texts. And part of that reason is this notion of becoming increasingly strategic. So what do we know about reading comprehension instruction? We've been talking so far about reading comprehension and contributors to it. What do we know about reading comprehension instruction? Well, this is a classic study that was conducted by Dolores Durkin back in 1978-79. She went into classrooms, she had some of her researchers go into classrooms to observe reading comprehension instruction. She observed in fourth grade classrooms, an important place, we've talked about that, 24 different classrooms, 13 school districts. And she observed for about 4,500 minutes. There were observations for about 4,500 minutes. And look, 28 of those minutes, less than 1%, was spent teaching students how to comprehend text. What Durkin found, that teachers were assigning students to read and then asking them questions, or having questions asked of them. So what was occurring was assessing comprehension, not teaching comprehension. And, you know, I will still see this in teacher preparation, where someone will design a reading comprehension lesson, and it will consist of reading a passage and then answering questions. Now you can extend that and you can make that into really how do you teach kids to understand the text, but that alone is really just assessing, not teaching reading comprehension. So this was kind of a wake-up call to the reading world, if you will. And it's probably not surprising that then when they launched into changing this, they began with what they knew, questions and questioning techniques. But they tried to kind of pull it apart a bit. So I remember when I was first teaching this class, in the chapter on reading comprehension, it was really about questioning. Is it an explicit question? Is it an implicit question? And question-answer relationships, QAR, was one of those kinds of strategies. So, and Tavani talks about this, she tweaks it a bit, but there are questions that are literal right there in the text. You have to think about things, think and search, you draw a conclusion, and maybe you have to pull together pieces of information, from various parts of the text, making an inference, and then just on your own, relying on your background knowledge. So being able to understand the kind of questions that were being asked and asking a variety of different questions was really what in many ways constituted some of those early efforts at reading comprehension instruction. Much like WH questions, which are perfectly legitimate questions, particularly if you can link them to story structure. So Mastropieri and Scruggs had a simple little sort of strategy. Ask yourself what or who is a paragraph about and what is happening to the who or what. Still, really not a bad strategy if you can help kids learn to do it on their own. And then what kind of happened was there's a shift in the reading comprehension instruction research, and it was beginning to ask, what do good readers do? And that is more like where we are now, and certainly what Tavani was talking about. And I read it, but I don't get it. So what do good readers do? Well, they monitor their comprehension, they construct mental images, they identify story grammars, particularly in narrative texts. They generate questions, they make inferences, and they summarize. And Tavani would add to that that they engage in fix-up strategies. So none of this should be new to you. The problem with the reading comprehension instruction literature and intervention was that the idea was good. We're going to teach poor readers to engage in the same strategies as good readers. However, the strategies were taught completely individually and in isolation. They were taught in inauthentic context, meaning that the teacher might give a student a worksheet and say, okay, engage in a prediction strategy. And they were taught quickly. So they didn't involve students the kind of deep processing that we know is very important for vocabulary instruction and also very important for reading comprehension instruction. The authors of this chapter, Omansi and Hart, argue that they taught poor readers the strategy rather than teaching them to be more strategic. But we do know more now, and we know what effective strategy instruction tends to look like. It's connected with the context of subject matter. In other words, it's learned in authentic texts. It is explicitly taught, and that is especially important for the students we see in the clinic and for students who are struggling with comprehension. Teachers give students choices, and they engage them in collaborative learning structures, which I'll come back to in a minute. And their goal is for their students to become independent and self-regulated readers. Two examples of good comprehension strategy instruction is reciprocal teaching and transactional strategy instruction. What both of these do, which is an element of effective strategy instruction, is that they teach multiple strategies. Not just one, but multiple strategies. And so let's look at reciprocal teaching. This is what we've been doing at Hamilton High School for the last couple of years. It takes teaching a strategy individually and practicing it. I'll come back to it. But in the end, groups of students, 4 students, learn prediction, generating questions, clarification, and summarizing. Each assumes responsibility for one of those strategies and talks about it with their peers. We also have them fill out a graphic organizer. And then the roles shift. The teacher initially is there supporting them, and then they become responsible for this collaborative group activity. So it is now learning in a social context, which is, I think, really important for adolescents. Transactional strategy instruction is a little different approach. The teacher models a variety of strategies, which the students then practice, with the goal that students will know which strategy to use as they are reading, and that their strategy may be different from their peers' strategy. So again, the goal is really being more flexible in terms of strategy use and being more independent in strategy use. Now, when we look at the chapter, Best Practices in Narrative Text Instruction, this is the graphic that they use to talk about effective strategy instruction. There's a context, there's an explicit set of strategies, there's scaffolding for transfer, and then agency and metacognition. And I'm just going to quickly go through these. But the context is important because it has to support students. They have to be able to say, I read it, but I don't get it. They have to feel safe saying, I'm confused. And they have to have opportunities to talk about texts. So really, we've almost come full circle here in a way, because the talk that young children engage in as they're listening is the same kind of talk in many ways that we want upper elementary and adolescents to engage in as they are grappling with text. And it is this struggle, this challenge of a difficult text that they have to experience. So it cannot be a place where teachers are only asking comprehension questions of them, but where they are really working with the text to try and understand it. And that takes time, and that takes patience, and it takes faith in their ability to do so. Effective strategy instruction must be explicit. It must be modeled, explained, it must be demonstrated through a think aloud, and then you must provide opportunities for guided practice. This is not easy work. And these set of comprehension strategies that are in this particular chapter are the same ones that you see upcoming over and over again. So you can be pretty assured that if you pick one of these, you're picking a very reasonable strategy to teach. Same ones in many ways that are in the book. I read it, but I don't get it. And those of you who have kids with comprehension difficulties in your practice, in your classrooms, in the clinic, I would just encourage you to go back and reread this text and take a good hard look at it, because I think it's a really good resource for you. So effective strategy instruction involves multiple strategies. Kids have to learn that they can be used flexibly, that they are interconnected. They have to be practiced. And they have to be practiced over time. And in our case, at the high school, it was almost an entire year. The last, say, last 3 months maybe of the year, they're in groups without the teacher really taking this on themselves. But it has taken it takes teaching them individually, practicing it, scaffolding it, and then letting them loose to try it on their own. So if you're going to teach a strategy, begin with a text that can be easily read, or a different kind of text like a cartoon, or even more concrete tasks like a movie, a video clip, or a picture book. And we began with video clips. Follow up with extensive guided practice. Kids need lots and lots of practice, let's say on video clips. Then maybe you're going to move to an easy text, and then you're going to move to a little more difficult text. So constantly scaffolding, constantly giving them opportunities for guided practice, always with the idea that they're going to become increasingly more strategic. And this, I think, is what we found in our work that has been so powerful. And that is that with this shift comes agency, comes a sense of being in control of one's own learning and thinking about one's own learning, and then being able to transfer it in different contexts. And what that has done is, I think it has really taken away a lot of the learned helplessness that adolescents with learning disabilities experience. So yes, they can comprehend the text, but equally important, they feel that they had an active participation in that process. And next week we'll look at informational text. Thank you.